Welcome to this evening's Living Wisely, Living Well. We take a reading, the daily reading from this book by Swami Kriyananda. And today's reading, I think all of us can find something to relate with today's reading. Swamiji says, judge a person, and then in parentheses, if you must, not by his foibles, but by how sincere he is in his search for truth and for God. The less you judge others, the easier it will be for you to accept yourself as you are. Self-acceptance is the first step, moreover, to self-correction. Remember my Guru's words. God doesn't mind your faults. He minds your indifference. I like the way that Swami Kriyananda began that. He said, again, I'll just read it just quickly. Judge a person, if you must, not by their foibles, but by how sincere he is in his speech and truth, sincere in his search for truth for God. Judge others if you must. Well, of course, we often talk about that how it's not a good thing to judge others, but he puts it in parentheses. He says, if you must. It's because it's a natural tendency of all of us. As long as we're in this worldly consciousness, we look out, we have these likes and dislikes. And we see something and we make a judgment of whether it conforms to our view of life, of how it satisfies us. And we like it, and we tend to think that's something good. And if we dislike it, we tend to think it's not so good. And we have this, and we begin this tendency of all of us do, to some extent, until we reach a point of freedom. But he says, judge not others their foibles. Now, what's a foible? Now, that's a good word, because a foible is not really a positive or negative. It's an odd idiosyncrasy. In other words, somebody has a characteristic that's just a little bit odd, and you say, well, he's just got a foible. It's like perhaps the uncle that is very strange, has some idiosyncrasies. He's a harmless fellow, but he's just a little bit strange in some ways, and so he's got his foibles. Well, all of us have foibles, and I think it's nice to look at ourselves in that way. Swamiji could have used some other words that people would have understood. He said, judge people by their, if you must, by their flaws or by their faults. But of course, those are very much loaded with value judgment. But instead, he says, by their foibles. And if you think about it, this is a nice way, you might say, to look at other people. If you're going to notice the idiosyncrasies of other people, and you're going to notice them by their personality, and you're going to assess them that way, why don't you let's think of other people as just having foibles. And if we see other people that way, well, then look in the mirror and we'll see ourselves. Yes, I've got some, not faults, I've got some idiosyncrasies and that I've picked up perhaps over how many incarnations, because all of us have them. Some little thing that distinguishes us. Maybe it's not a major thing, maybe it's a small thing, but it's followed us, trails us, and we perhaps try to get rid of it, but it just sticks. And sometimes, of course, these things are a little bit more serious. But think of them, I think the point I am making here is think of them not so much in terms of value judgment, but stepping back from them and seeing them as something that simply needs to be corrected, something that is a little bit of a blockage that we need to work on. And if we see them in that way, we don't react, you might say, emotionally to them. Sometimes people see faults in themselves. They obviously see them in other people, but if they also see them in themselves, sometimes it's a little bit alarming to them and they sweep it under the carpet. And that's certainly not something we want to do when we're looking at foibles within ourselves. So if there's something that's blocking us from making progress, well, we want to address it. We want to do what's necessary. But you have to understand that as we progress along the spiritual path, there are always going to be people, other people, and maybe you're one of them, see it in yourself. You're going to see the flaws in something. Imagine a very clear window, or perhaps it's not a clear window, it's a dirty window, but you spend great effort erasing all of the dust on that window, impurities on that window. You clean it and scrub it, and you have it just absolutely perfectly clean, except down in the corner there's a smudge. Now somebody comes in, walks in the door, visits you, and you point out the view through the window, and he looks through the window and he says, "Look at that smudge on the bottom of the window there." Or you might perhaps you've just painted your house inside, you've made it a nice room, but there's a little bit of a spill or a mispainting, or you skipped a little something. Isn't it so often that people, instead of seeing the 99% of the nice job you have done, their eye immediately goes to that little flaw? A diamond could be perfect, nice beautiful diamond, but has one little crack in it, and perhaps it loses 90% of its value because of that one little perceptive difficulty in that. So it's so often like that. Our mind tends to go to that which is not perfect. And this can be very difficult for us if we're looking at ourselves and we have our standards so high that we pretty soon we begin to feel we're incapable, or perhaps we're inadequate. We see other people in that way. And the bad part of it is not that we shouldn't be observant to the flaws of other people, perhaps, or ourselves, or the world at large, in a neutral way, because we're not blind and we're not dumb. I mean, we can forgive other people, like St. Francis in the story of his forgiving the robbers in the neighborhood and taking them in. He was not blind to the faults of the people around him, but he saw people according to their highest potential. He did not identify other people according to their foibles. And this is the same thing that what we want. There's just something that's there that needs to be a little bit of attention given to it, rub it off. Don't identify other people by them, and for sure don't identify yourself by them, because I've noticed that people that tend to see flaws in other people readily, see the foibles, you might say, tend to be sensitive also to the ones in themselves, because what they're doing is, of course, they're projecting outwards things that they see wrong in their own selves. If we can learn to be a little bit more, you say, not seeing the flaws outwardly, it says, like in this reading, that we learn to be a little bit more self-accepting of ourselves. But self-acceptance of our own foibles, or self-acceptance of other people's foibles, you might say, if they're obstructive, it doesn't mean being complacent. It means seeing them in their true perspective. It's not who and what they are. It's not who and what you are. It's simply something that needs to be corrected. Now, you will find in yourself, and I've noticed in life in general, that as you become more purified in your habits, you become more sattvic in your habits, you begin to you begin to acquire a certain amount of virtues, those things that are less virtuous in you, they tend to take on, you begin to notice them more. Other people tend to notice them more. And haven't you found this, the case that when somebody's a very virtuous person, there's always going to be somebody that wants to point out that person's fault, or the little things that are wrong with them. You take a Mother Teresa, and most people respect her, but there's going to be somebody that's going to write an article about, well, that's all very fine, but she had this bad trait or this bad habit. Mahatma Gandhi was, people write about his habits, and it gets all blown out of proportion because they don't see the greater good. They just see that little foible, let's say, in that person's personality. But when we look at others, wouldn't it be better to evaluate other people according to what they aspire to, not according to the little foibles that they might have? And this is what Swami is saying in this reading. Judge another person's foibles, if you must, according to their sincerity for seeking God. You might say according to their high ideals, somebody that aspires very high. And if you're one such person, I can guarantee you one thing. If you aspire very, very high in this life, you're going to stumble and fall sometime. Because you set the bar high, and the higher you more, it's like a jumper, high jumper. He jumps over the bar, and then he raises a little bit, and he jumps over the bar again, and he raises it, and it keeps going until finally he knocks the bar off, and you might say he failed. He didn't jump over the bar, but he's aspiring to get better and better at all times, and so he raises the bar until he reaches the point where he now has a challenge. And so same it is with all of us in life. You're going to find people who aspire much are also people who stumble much because they're trying. Now, one sometimes solution, well, I don't want to fail, I don't want to stumble, so what's the solution to that? Well, I just won't try. I'll just step back. And you find this, unfortunately, in people. They don't take up a challenge because they're afraid of failure. They're afraid they're going to stumble. They're afraid that people are going to judge them as failures. And if they take that route, well, you can see it's pretty soon it's a rejection, and they don't make the progress. And so ideally, we want to set our bar high. Take the risk that you're going to, yes, knock that bar off its stand perhaps, and perhaps you're going to stumble. But the important thing is you get up again and again and again to keep trying. And anybody who has been successful in life, this has been something that they've had to encounter and overcome. Now, I've mentioned, don't identify and see the glass, the clean glass, and identify it and define it by the little smudges on the side. This is, you could say, another way Master Paramahansa Yogananda used to explain. He says, don't ever call yourself a sinner, because if you start looking at your faults too much, I'm not speaking of objectively looking at them so that you can improve them. Yes, we want to do that. But if you start identifying yourself by your faults, pretty soon that's seeing yourself as sinner consciousness. And you begin to then say, well, that's just who I am. What do you expect? That's who I am. And you begin to ingrain that in yourself, and you begin to limit your own potential. And once you do that, then you're going to find it very difficult to take up the path again and overcome that, because you start that becomes your self-identity in some fashion. Oh, I'm a failure, or I can't do this, or I can't do that. I've done it many times before, and I always seem to be failing. We don't want to do that. The classic story of that, of course, is when Master went to a revival meeting in Los Angeles in the 1920s. And there was a very famous evangelist preacher in those days. She was a lady. And she was doing a revival meeting with, hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the audience. And she says, you are all sinners, and I want you to get down on your knees as sinners. And Master said, everybody, she looked around, and everybody was down on their knees, identifying themselves as a sinner. But he said, I refused, not out of pride, but I refused to identify and call myself a sinner. We're children of God, and our potential, our potential is divine perfection. Now, I've noticed it's been I've had discussions with people, and we've perhaps been maybe talking about something, and I've mentioned something inadvertently. Perhaps it came off as a little bit of a criticism. And the person says, oh, you're very judgmental. You shouldn't, I don't want to be judged. And so naturally, maybe you've run into that. People say, people are always judging me, and I don't like it. Well, I've noticed that some people seem to have this judgmental consciousness within themselves, that they're feeling judged. Why? Why feel judged? I think personally, I think it's a sign of spiritual insecurity, to have too much consciousness of that. Because the fact is, maybe they are being judged. But how can you, that's something that everybody endures. All of us endures. And those people who are very, very sensitive to it, perhaps are a little bit secure about their own place or their own spiritual situation. Or perhaps they are reluctant to look in the mirror and recognize that, yes, maybe these people that are judging you, maybe they have a point. Now, it's perhaps not nice, but if we feel that others are judging us, the thought that you can somehow convince other people to stop it is not effective. You have to learn within yourself to be able to accept that and raise yourself to the point where you're above that. If secure in yourself, acceptance of yourself, what does it matter what other people think? Because you know if what truth is truth. But oftentimes, most people, if they look inside themselves, they know. Perhaps they have been wrong. Perhaps they do have that fault. They just don't like anybody pointing it out. So if you're in that side, that you're feeling other people are judging you too much, too harshly, well, maybe it's true. But how do you fix that? And one is look in yourself and fix whatever it is that you think may be the problem. But you can't run away from other people judging you. And of course, very unlikely to get other people to stop doing that. Ultimately, I think the solution to all of these is if you're feeling that way, feel instead, try to at least, God's presence within. Go within. Give your problems to God. God doesn't judge anybody. He sees all of us as who and what we are. We're divine children. And all of us are equal in God's estimation. Some of us, of course, are taking a little bit of time to live up to our potential, but yet the potential is always there. And that's how God sees us. God sees us as light. Just as Master would say, you don't know how beautiful everything is. It's all divine light. So if we feel God's presence within ourselves, then nothing, you could say, whatever anybody else says, it does not matter because we have God's presence within ourselves. Now, that last sentence in this reading today perhaps is the most important of them, and I'll remind you what it is. It says, God doesn't mind our faults. He minds our indifference. It's an indifference that he doesn't like. To be indifferent, in other words, spiritually indifferent, to not care. Sometimes people become so discouraged. They try to improve themselves. They try to develop spiritual qualities, or if you even put it into a worldly context, they try to improve themselves, become successful, to change their habits. And maybe they're a smoker, they want to overcome smoking and they can't do it, they're continually failing, whatever it might be. They sometimes get to the point where it says, I just don't care anymore, I'm not going to try anymore. Now, this is where we get into a dangerous situation. Because once you become indifferent, you stop caring, or at least perhaps you're giving the impression of that, the semblance of that. But when we stop caring, it's as if our journey has come to a stop. Imagine at nighttime, you're in the forest and you're carrying a lamp. You can see ahead of you with the lamp, but if the wind comes up and blows that lamp out, now it's totally dark, you don't have any light to be able to see. And what can you do but stop? You have to stop. And you'll stay stopped until you light that lamp once again. And sometimes a long time can go by. Perhaps it can be a lifetime to go by that you find yourself waiting until eventually you are motivated once again. And what is it, if you stop like that, what is it that finally motivates you? Well, unfortunately, often you're motivated because you start to suffer again. What started you moving in the direction of your divine quest in the first place? It was your desire for God, your desire for bliss, your desire for joy, but it was also to get out of the suffering that inevitably we'll find if we attach ourselves and think that our happiness is outside of ourselves in this world. Krishna says, get away, O Arjuna, from this ocean of suffering. And eventually, if we just give up, something is going to have to motivate us. And don't wait for the world itself to motivate you. Do you remember that story from the autobiography of a yogi where the disciple comes to Sri Yukteswar, who's the brother disciple of Yogananda, and he has bad habits, and he wants to go home, to his village, and Sri Yukteswar advises him not to. It's not a good idea, but yet he insists, and he goes home, and he's away. And when he comes back, he's taken up all sorts of bad habits as he's been away. And Sri Yukteswar asks Yogananda Mukunda in those days, he asks him, he says, you have to tell him that he's no longer fit to live here in the ashram. He says, from now on, the world, of suffering, the world must be his guru. And because he's unable, he's closed himself off and is unable to be open to receive the guidance, the intuitive guidance of the guru. And the same thing with us. Indifference is the greatest enemy, because when we are indifferent, we don't care any longer, we close the door to guidance. And so as long as we keep that door open, we care, we make faults, and we do faults, we do things wrong, but doggone it, I want to improve. I'm going to do better. I want to do better next time. Guru, show me. And little by little, if we want to improve, if we want to rise spiritually, God will help us. And sometimes it's through the learning process of trial and error, but eventually our journey continues, and that light of divine, of wanting God. Now this is, to desire God, it's said, is the one desire that is good to have. We often talk about how it's necessary on the spiritual path to get rid of all desires, but except for that one. Because it's that desire for God that is the desire will ultimately free us from all other desires. And so maintaining whatever it takes in your spiritual life to keep up your desire to make progress, to go forward. I think it comes, I don't think it comes just from technique. I don't think doing more kriyas is going to necessarily help you. It could. Meditating longer, is that going to help you? It could, but it may not also. The one surefire solution, I think, is to keep a living, breathing sense of God and Guru's presence with you in your heart at all times. This is where the devotional side has to come in, because to approach the spiritual path strictly through technique or strictly through the intellect, these tend to fluctuate much more than the pure sincerity of desire to be one with God that's in the heart. To tell Guru, Guru, I love you. I want you in my life. Come to me, come to me. Divine Mother, please come to me. To have that longing in the heart for God, that's the most precious gift. And this is what we have to cultivate, because that will be, truly, that's our raft across this ocean of delusion, to continually feed that devotional longing of the heart. And then you have that, somehow everything else seems to fall into place. So if you're feeling judged, let it go. Don't judge others. Just see them according to their highest potential. And going back to where we started, if you see these idiosyncrasies in other people, don't see them as flaws. Don't see them, just see them as foibles. I think that's, again, a nice word. Think of it as that way. Indifference is our greatest enemy. Keep that hope alive for God's contact, and surely you'll be successful. Many blessings to all of you.